Hi there, my name's Susie and I'm the Operations Manager at the Julian Teaching School Hub based at Notre Dame High School in Norwich. This session on creating inclusive communities was originally delivered to trainee teachers in late 2025. Let's start with the basics. What is diversity, equity, inclusion and belonging, and why does it matter? We hear about DEI a lot these days, and not always in a positive way, but how often do we stop to think about what it means? Diversity, equity, and inclusion are words that are often used interchangeably, but they don't actually mean the same thing. Diversity is the differences between people, as you see on the screen. Diversity isn't something we can necessarily control in our classrooms. We can't make Norfolk a more diverse county, however hard we try, but we can control equity and inclusion. Equity is different from equality. Equality is treating everyone the same, giving every individual or group the same resources and opportunities. Equality is about input with no regard for outcome. In the classroom, equality looks like giving every pupil the same learning resources. Equity means acknowledging that we are not all starting in the same place. Equity is about giving everyone what they need to get to the same endpoint. Equity in the classroom looks like knowing that pupils have diverse needs and distributing resources accordingly, with some students receiving audiobooks, digital versions, or adapted versions of textbooks. An excellent quote to illustrate this is from Susan K. Gardner of Oregon State University. Equality is giving everyone a shoe. Equity is giving everyone a shoe that fits. Inclusion is what we get when we treat people with equity. Inclusion is knowing that we are respected and involved regardless of difference or diversity. Inclusion is an active state where we work to make everyone feel welcome and valued for our contributions. And finally, belonging is the culmination of DEI. It's an environment where we don't just participate but feel at home, where we feel safe to be ourselves, knowing that we won't be penalised for our differences. So how do we make sure every child feels that belonging within our schools? Safety seems obvious, but we should be including here psychological safety. That includes our own as educators as well as the pupils. Psychological safety means feeling safe to take interpersonal risks, to speak up, or to disagree openly. For pupils, it manifests as feeling secure enough to raise their hands even when unsure, challenge ideas respectfully, and view errors as learning opportunities rather than sources of shame. We can encourage psychological safety by modelling vulnerability, acknowledging our own learning journeys, including mistakes and opportunities. Knowing and accepting each child speaks to equity. We need to understand where they're starting from and what their individual learning needs are, and we need to fully accept any accommodations they need rather than trying to fit them all into the same box. We can help this along through listening. There are multiple stakeholders in a child's education, including the child, and if we allow all of those stakeholders a voice, we contribute to that safety we spoke of. That doesn't mean that we obey everybody's whim or give every voice equal weight. It just means that the more rounded a picture we have of the children in our classes, the better we can anticipate their learning needs. Respectful relationships are simply the positive connections between people that foster positive social interactions and establish an environment of trust and support. In a trusting and supportive environment, people can disagree and challenge each other. We should model and promote this in the classroom. Healthy relationships rely on healthy boundaries consistently enforced. And finally, agency. Agency is the belief that what you do makes a difference and that you have the skills and the opportunity to do it. This affects us as educators. Do we feel that we have agency in the classroom? Do we feel that we are free to be creative? Do we feel respected? And the same for the pupils. Do they feel respected and accepted? You could pause the recording here to take 2 minutes just to jot down any ideas about how this might look in your own classroom. So with all that said, there are certain constraints and considerations that we must take into account. We are bound by multiple statutory documents and duties, as well as our own school or trust policies and guidelines. We must adhere to these when thinking about creating our inclusive community. As a baseline, the curriculum you teach will likely be set by the school within the confines of the national curriculum, and this includes topics such as PSHE. The amount of control you have over what you teach will vary. Some multi-academy trusts have fully centralised lesson resources that you must use, while others will encourage you to create your own. If you work in a faith school, you are further bound by policies of your diocese, particularly around the teaching of RSE. In Norfolk, we have a lot of Church of England schools, and the Diocese of Norwich will have policies to abide by. I'm based at Notre Dame High School, which is a Catholic school. At NDHS, we are answerable to the diocese, the Catholic Education Service, the bishop, and ultimately the Pope. This can have a huge impact on lesson planning, classroom practice, communication, and extracurricular offers. But we also need to consider wider societal issues and how children may interact with them. For example, current discourse around LGBTQ+ identities, immigration, or women's reproductive rights. We will all have personal and deeply held opinions on issues such as these, but that doesn't mean we should share them indiscriminately. We don't know what parent and carer attitudes are, or what children see and hear outside of our classroom, and we need to be sensitive to this and led by the school. We can't always share our opinions freely, and nor should we expect to be able to. That's not our job. You might want to find out if your school has a DEI lead and consult them on any additions to your classroom practice that you're planning. Defer to others' expertise. Now let's consider what diversity actually looks like. Not all aspects of somebody's identity are immediately obvious. You can see here both visible and invisible diversity of identity, albeit using very broad brushstrokes. There is so much we can't know just by looking at a pupil, or indeed a colleague or family member. Even ethnicity may not be obvious. Sexual orientation and gender identity are not necessarily obvious, not something we should assume, and not something we should necessarily expect to know. And when it comes to invisible disability, there are so many. There's mental health, dyslexia, autism and other neurodivergence, or sight or hearing loss. Pupils may be living with one or more of these and may not have been diagnosed. We know, for example, that ADHD is increasingly being diagnosed in adulthood, especially for women, because A, it presents differently in women, and B, girls are taught to mask inconvenient feelings and behaviour at a young age. Examples of other aspects of identity could include Gypsy Roma traveller families, young carers, English as an additional language, looked after children, or a possible multitude of other difficulties fully accessing learning. And again, we may not know. My 21-year-old nephew, for example, has tinnitus, which he's so used to having that he never tells anyone he has it. We also need to take into account how different aspects of identity interact. For example, what we just said regarding ADHD and girls. Gender and neurodivergence intersecting to add a layer of difficulty over and above simply having ADHD. In addition, we need to consider that children who already feel vulnerable due to one aspect of their identity may not wish to make themselves even more so by disclosing another. For example, a black child may feel extra reluctant to disclose that they are also a young carer. And we also need to remember that identity isn't fixed and can change over time or suddenly. A previously seemingly happy and well-adjusted student may develop a serious mental illness, as in fact I did when I was at school. A pupil may become disabled after an accident. Their family circumstances may change suddenly. And remember that changes such as these may come with uncertainty and a degree of trauma. Therefore, a truly inclusive classroom or community must be able to accommodate unseen need and anticipate future need as much as possible. So you could pause here and take 2 minutes to think about your own pupils. Do you think there is any unseen need that you could work to accommodate? So let's think about accessibility. This isn't an exhaustive list, But there are some easy habits to get into that will make your classroom as equitable as possible. As you can see from this list, these are not visible characteristics, and not all may be diagnosed or communicated to the school. So, for example, children with sensory issues may become overwhelmed by things that don't affect most other children. Creating a calm, uncluttered learning environment will help them. Hearing impairments can take some time to be noticed, let alone treated, if they can be treated. It's good practice to ensure that all children face the teacher when instructions are given, and that audio and video content is clear and free of distortion. For some children that struggle with high-ceilinged, echoey classrooms, seating them directly in front of a wall or similar surface can help. Enabling subtitles on videos also it helps children with multiple learning difficulties. And we'll talk more about language in a minute, but we should always be careful not to use stigmatizing language. This is easy when we think about, for example, not saying racist things, but language that stigmatizes, for example, mental ill health is actually increasingly common. How often do we say, oh, that's crazy, or bonkers, or oh, a bit OCD? And I do it myself, despite having a mental health disability. As adults, we know that things like that are just figures of speech. But for a child struggling with thoughts or feelings they don't understand, the harm could be significant. And finally, visual accessibility is also important. Font size, background colour, and so on, as well as verbal explanations, can help pupils who struggle to access simply words on a board or page. In general, clear instructions delivered in a calm classroom in multiple formats will help the accessibility of your classroom, even if you don't know every pupil's needs. So this is a really great quote by Benny Cara, and I owe a lot of this part of the session to her book, Diversity in Schools. In particular, I love the idea of an actively constructed entity. It emphasises that we need to be intentional in how we approach inclusivity. We need to think about how we avoid tribalism and instead acknowledge the multiple identities in the room and encourage their integration. A good example of this is our seating plan. Research shows that if students are allowed to choose their own seating, they will gravitate to sitting with those they perceive to be most like them, most notably in racial groups, where they may perceive safety in numbers. Creating a seating plan that mixes up races and ethnicities discourages this unconscious tribalism. Another aspect of a good seating plan to consider is gender. It's quite common to alternate boy, girl, but this creates issues if a child identifies, openly or otherwise, as a different gender, or indeed as no gender. Degendering the classroom as much as possible will benefit these students without even needing to be explicit about it. It also helps us if we interrogate our own bias, unconscious or otherwise. Research shows that in cross-sex, two-party conversations, so a man and woman talking to each other, men accounted for 96% of interruptions and 100% of overlaps, starting to talk before the other has finished. It's worth thinking about how confident you are encouraging female voices in your classroom, because research also shows that teachers are more likely to allow interruptions from boys, are more likely to allow boys to interrupt girls, and that girls are, therefore, less likely to speak up. Some strategies around good talk that serve to level the classroom in terms of this unconscious bias could be: consider how you allocate talk partners, not randomly. Teach students about the dynamics of talk, including gendered approaches. Allocate an observer in talk-based activities who monitors interruptions or dominance. Or use the chip strategy. Give pupils an equal number of tokens that they spend on contributions to the discussion. When they're gone, they're gone. And actively bring attention to the negative effects of interruption. All of this is not to imply that boys have an advantage in the classroom. We all know the concerns around boys' achievement compared to girls. So it's worth remembering that gendered language harms everyone. Think of boys will be boys, or man up. A policy of removing this kind of language from your classroom completely is a good starting point. So maybe take another minute now to think about accessibility in your classroom, whether it be related to the previous slide or this one. Can you take steps to increase accessibility or to degender the environment? We know that names have power, and pronouncing names correctly should be the baseline in your classroom. One incorrect pronunciation is forgivable, any more than that is not. It's the very least we can do for our students and colleagues to learn how to pronounce their names. Their name is who they are and reflects their background and heritage. If appropriate to your setting, phase, or context, exploring names across cultures and history is a lovely way of showing that all names are valuable, because they carry cultural history. As an example, you can take a common name and see how many cultures or languages have the same or similar name. A teacher making time to explore how names in a classroom can be linked is a powerful message for students and an opening to begin to explore the various different cultures represented in your classroom. If, as may be common in Norfolk, your students are from the same racial or ethnic group and all have very pronounceable names, this isn't an excuse to ignore learning about different cultures. Students carry misconceptions about other cultures, and demystifying those cultures creates an open-minded and outward-looking community that knows how to welcome diversity. The process of names and naming things is central to DEI work. Developing and using a shared language to talk about difficult or uncomfortable concepts demystifies them and makes it possible to have open and respectful conversations. The most widely used acronym for ethnicity in the UK is BAME, B-A-M-E, standing for Black, Asian and Minority Ethnic. It isn't perfect and has faced criticism for lumping identities together and not including Gypsy Roma traveller identities. In addition, the use of minority ethnic raises concerns as diminishing those whose race is actually the global majority. POC, people of colour, is also widely used, encompassing anyone who is not white. It's worth keeping track of what terms are used, as well as any criticism around them, and how and why terms change. And it's also important to know that these signifiers are used to speak about groups of people. If you have a child in front of you who is black, it is perfectly fine to refer to them as such. Now, I've spoken about race and ethnicity together, and it's worth understanding what we mean by these words in this context. Race tends to be seen as a fixed marker of identity, whereas ethnicity encompasses culture, traditions, and social identity as well. We should also think about terminology around disability, which is nuanced and, like race and sexuality, often self-determined. A lot of common phrases that we might say without thinking too hard are actually ableist. For example, we may still hear people referred to as wheelchair-bound, which is a phrase that implies the wheelchair is a confining entity rather than a mobility device that allows the user their freedom. We also need to be careful not to imply that someone's disability is their defining feature or a terrible disadvantage that must be overcome. And of course, we need to be very wary of falling into the inspirational mindset around, for example, the Paralympics. Another example of evolving language is around LGBTQ+ identities and the expansion of the acronym from LGB in the 80s and before to the much wider spectrum of sexuality and gender expression that we now use. And finally, when we think about the power of naming things, it's encouraging to see increased use of the terms neurodiversity and neurodivergent, acknowledging that we don't all process life in the same way. So language and names have a huge amount of power, and by being confident in the language of diversity, we have a mechanism to discuss it. So for the last time, I'd like you to take a couple of minutes to think about your own confidence using various different terms or language around DEI. What could you learn more about? So we've talked about diversity among our pupils, but what about ourselves and our identity as educators? There is a fairly well-known campaign by Mental Health First Aid England called My Whole Self, where they want organisations to empower employees to bring their whole self to work. This is a laudable campaign. However, as educators, we must acknowledge that our workplaces are different from most. Depending on education stage and context, we may need to hold parts of ourselves back away from the classroom in order to maintain our own safety. I spoke earlier about the constraints on us in the classroom, whether they be statutory, school-based, religious, or other. We need to consider those carefully when we think about what we might share with our students. We all know about keeping social media private and clean, but that isn't all that I'm talking about. While we may feel that sharing our whole selves will help pupils to appreciate and accept diversity, we also deserve a private life. Not everybody needs to know how I identify, who I love, who I live with, or who I consider my family. And in increasingly fraught times politically, we don't want to provide ammunition to people who might take it online and use our identities against us. Not only this, but some schools or large trusts are even moving away from having photos of staff on their websites, in case those photos are used with bad intentions. So we need to remember that our own identities are as personal to us as the children's in our classes, and we don't need to share everything about our lives in order to teach with authenticity. That's all I have. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to my thoughts. I've put all my resources and further reading into a Padlet that you can find by scanning the QR code on the screen. You can get in touch with me via the email address on screen, and you can find the Julian Teaching School Hub online in various places. Thank you again.